Good evening in Australasia, good afternoon in Asia, and good morning in Europe, and welcome to this event from the Asian Racing Federation. My name is Martin Perbrick, and I chair the ARF Council on Anti-Illegal Betting and Related Financial Crime, which is a task force for the Asian Racing Federation. And our focus today is on the latest report from the ARF Council, which is the state of illegal betting, which I hope you've all read cover to cover. And have lots of questions on that. And we have three panelists who'll talk through areas of the report today. And all three of our panelists were involved in compiling the report and actually involved in compiling many reports and commentating on areas of sports integrity in a broad range of forums. So if I could first give their background and explain the purpose of the session today and the report. First panelist will be James Porteous. James works at the Hong Kong Jockey Club, conducting due diligence research, has a very, very strong research team there, I know. His team conducts research into global illegal betting markets, links to transnational organized crime, and the wide negative impacts on society of that illegal betting. James had a long career as a sports journalist before, with the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong and the Herald in Glasgow before that. And someone who can talk knowledgeably, I would say, about racing, many other sports and betting, which is a bit of a trick. Secondly, we have Catherine Ordway, who's Professor of Sports Management at the University of Canberra. Catherine lectures in sports integrity, ethics, law and leadership in sport. She's an acknowledged, I think, international expert in the field of integrity in sports and specialized in anti-doping policy for 20 years. She's widely published papers and books on sports integrity, governance, and gender equality issues. And I was going to say she's a very sought-after commentator. She's a very wide commentator and conference presenter, so it's very difficult to get her time. So we're very grateful for Catherine to making the time today. Thirdly, last but not least, Professor Jack Anderson, Director of Sports Law Studies at the University of Melbourne. Jack's primary research interest is the relationship between sport and the law. And again, Jack has published very widely on that area and comments very often in a number of well-regarded forums. Welcome to all of you. We'll get started shortly, but if I can just give a little bit of background. So for those of you that don't know the Asian Racing Federation, I think there are a few people from the ARF on today. It's a federation of horse racing authorities. So it's not operators, although some of the authorities are operators, but the Asian Racing Federation established the ARF Council, our body, in 2017. Although actually we'd been doing this work for many years before that. ARF Council now has 18 members. It's a think tank, basically, and the members are from organizations in horse racing and other sports integrity, law enforcement, international organizations such as Interpol, UNODC, and academia. We have 6 professors from universities on this body. The purpose of the council is really to enhance international cooperation amongst horse racing, other sports authorities, regulators, intergovernmental organizations and agencies to better combat the threat of illegal betting and related financial crimes in how they threaten horse racing and other sports integrity. That might seem rather a narrow area, just illegal betting, but I think as you can see from the report, it touches a lot of areas of sport and society. So I won't go into that today, we'll get into aspects of it shortly. But why did we write this report, The State of Illegal Betting? Well, firstly, we wanted to show what's really happening now with illegal betting and what does illegal betting mean around the world as betting on horse racing and other sports grows considerably, especially during the pandemic, which we'll talk about shortly. I think during the pandemic, we've seen far greater liquidity injected into betting markets, both legal and illegal. And our view is that liquidity in betting markets, as it goes down, especially to lower level competitions, does increasingly threaten integrity in those competitions. Especially if it's through betting markets that are not well regulated and monitored. And for those of you who are not in Asia, there are significantly large betting markets in Asia that are not regulated. They're effectively illegal. So we do feel that illegal betting is a growing problem. Perhaps some of you in the Americas and Europe don't see it as much, but in Asia, it's a far more visible problem. So I won't say any more about the subject, but we'll leave that to the panelists. But just a little bit of administration. Just to remind you, we're on Zoom webinar. So sorry that all 80 of you attendees, we can't see you or hear you, but we do want to hear from you. So please, if you have questions as we go through, please put the questions in the Zoom chat and we'll come to them in due course after the panelists have given some opening remarks. So perhaps if we could start off with James. James, obviously you led really the core piece of research for the state of illegal betting, and you've been leading this research for some years. Could you just give us an overview? What have you found in this research for the state of illegal betting report? And also maybe talk us through how has that situation changed in the last 5 years? Over to you, James.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So, I think one of the main things we found was data-driven confirmation of issues, which we had seen developing over the past 5 years, the blurring of the lines between markets, the fact that illegal markets outpacing legal markets in terms of growth, and how rapid advancements in technology were facilitating those. But with this report, we really have hard numbers to back up those claims, which we had seen in the past. So the report, which I'll go through in about 10 minutes, Martin's talked about the purpose of the report, which is really, as Martin said, it's an issue still too little understood by racing and other sports, governments, law enforcement, and other stakeholders. And by stakeholders, we mean anybody with an interest in sport. So in terms of key findings from section 1, as said, this was a data-driven exercise, and we'll talk about the methodology of how we collated that data in a minute. But the key findings when we had analyzed the data were that the illegal market comprises almost 2/3 of the entire market and is growing faster than the legal market. So simply put, illegal betting is massive and is growing more quickly than the legal market. And this remains a key threat to the integrity of racing and to other sports. Martin, you mentioned key changes from around 5 years ago, and I think technology is really the key. I mean, technology has moved so quickly, not just in online gambling, but in all walks of life. But particularly in the online gambling industry, the underregulated and unregulated operators, and we'll explain what that means in the next slide, are much faster to adapt to and adopt the latest technologies to make their product more attractive because they don't operate under any regulatory overhead to slow them down. Things like cryptocurrencies, they were really only just coming on the radar 5 years ago. And as you can see on the second last bullet point here, they're now on about 1/4 of all websites and almost 2/3 of unlicensed websites. And finally, at the last bullet point, when it comes to technology, key point for people to bear in mind, it's easier than ever to become an illegal bookmaker and set up an online betting website. 3/4 of websites rely on third-party business-to-business software, and 42% use mirror websites to avoid detection. And we'll explain a bit more about those in a moment. So in terms of how we collated the data, this might look a bit complicated. It's actually quite simple. It was a filtering process. We started with about 20,000 online gambling websites. These are websites categorized as gambling or gambling sports betting by SimilarWeb, which is a leading web analytics tool used by Google, Walmart, and many other Fortune 500 companies. So we took from that 20,000 all of the ones with monthly traffic of more than 1 million visits. Then we added a randomized selection to ensure we weren't just only getting the biggest ones. And then we added a further list of websites we identified in previous research, which we suspected would be unlicensed when we looked at them more closely. We then removed false positives, websites which weren't offering sports betting or were blogs and similar, or affiliate marketing sites and similar. And we ended up with 534 websites from about 61 different jurisdictions around the globe. So it's a broad sample of the entire global online betting market. In terms of the analysis, we looked at them all both manually and using software APIs to track licensing details, web traffic data going back over 24 months, website server location and characteristics, which products they offered, customer demographics, and more. So we had a large data set, and from that we identified and culled key trends and data points, which went into section 1 and section 2 of the final report. So first of all, in terms of categorization, a question we get asked at every single presentation we do is, what is the definition of illegal betting? Unfortunately, due to the transnational global nature of online betting, some jurisdictions have no set gambling laws. Some laws were written in the early 20th century or even the 19th century in some jurisdictions when online betting was not quite as big an issue, and so on. So there's no unified or agreed definition. The European Council's Macallan Convention is the closest, but it's argued about as well. We focused on quite a simple question: is the betting operator licensed at the point of sale, i.e., in the same jurisdiction as the customers that it takes bets from? So that gave us 3 categories. 2 purple ones here on the screen are pretty easy to understand and intuitive. You have licensed and regulated, and these are operators which take bets from customers where they are licensed. So UK operators who are licensed by the UK Gambling Commission, taking bets from UK customers. Australian, US operators who are licensed by the relevant state operator in those territories and taking bets from US and Australian customers, and so on. The unlicensed and unregulated operators, well, those, they have no license at all. They're not interested in being licensed. And we see these a lot, especially in Asia. And these are typically run directly by organized crime. In the middle is the licensed but under-regulated operators. Now, these have licenses from certain jurisdictions, but we call them under-regulated because they take bets from all over the world, regardless of whether or not they're licensed in those jurisdictions and regardless of the prevailing legality or lawfulness of betting in those jurisdictions. So the key point to understand is that both under-regulated and unregulated operators, the 2 categories on the right-hand side, are effectively illegal betting in most jurisdictions. When we then, categorized the data set with those 3 categories, fully 61% of the websites examined were in one of the 2 latter categories. So in other words, almost 2/3 of the market is in effect illegal betting. And of the hundreds of websites which were licensed but under-regulated, just 3 jurisdictions issued almost 2/3 of such licenses. As you can see on the map, in Curacao, a handful of private companies issue licenses with what appears to be close to 0 oversight. The only paperwork or credentials you need for a license is a check for 35 to 50,000 euros. The Netherlands, of which Curacao is a constituent country, is trying to strengthen that at the moment. In the Philippines, the entire purpose of the so-called Philippines Offshore Gaming Operators License, or POGO, is to lend a veneer of respectability to operators who target bettors across Asia. And in virtually every jurisdiction in Asia, online gambling is typically unlawful, illegal, or heavily restricted to a limited number of operators in each jurisdiction. And as a recent arrest in Macau of one key figure behind one Pogo licensee for alleged illegal gambling, money laundering, and links to Chinese triad societies illustrates, such operators are often linked to organized crime and other criminality. Malta, a European Union state which relies on issuing online gambling licenses for about 12% of its entire GDP, will argue that it has better standards of oversight than the Philippines and the Curacao. And while that may be true, it too has had issues with, for example, multiple cases of Italian organized crime groups using Maltese licensed betting operators to launder criminal proceeds. We also saw that, so when we looked at the web traffic data, and if you remember, this research kind of spanned the pre and post-COVID period, we saw that although all websites had seen significant traffic growth over the period, hastened and accelerated by the impacts of COVID, such as lockdown-induced boredom, stimulus checks, and so on. This was nearly double in the unregulated market, 64% versus the 36% traffic growth, as you can see on the screen. And reasons that these markets grow more quickly or can attract customers more quickly is because they, again, they're not subject to regulatory oversight. They can aggressively market through social media spam. They can offer better prices, i.e. odds, than the legal markets oftentimes, because they pay minimal or zero tax and have little of the other overhead of well-regulated operators. And they can offer many more products, such as different sports to bet on and different bet types within those sports, again, because they're not subject to any regulatory oversight. So a key fact for regulators to understand is that the focus should be on the under-regulated and unregulated operators, and not over-regulating licensed and regulated operators and driving customers to these illegal markets. In terms of products offered, we found that more than a third of websites offer racing. Racing continues to be a major betting product. And of those which did offer racing, the vast majority offered racing from ARF member jurisdictions. In other words, illegal betting continues to be a major threat to the integrity of Asian racing, of racing in Asian Racing Federation jurisdictions. Relatively new products such as esports have grown rapidly, now available on about 2/3 of websites. And that's a potential concern given the appeal of that particular product to attract young people and its lack of well-developed integrity safeguards compared to perhaps more mature sports. The vast majority of so-called sports betting websites also offer many more products than just sports betting. Live dealer casino games, digital slot machines, random number generated video games with gambling elements, and so on. Unlike sports betting, which involves skill, these have no skill at all, are completely random, and again, can lead to high frequency gambling behavior, excessive gambling, and problem gambling. And that's one reason why excessive gambling and problem gambling is more prevalent in the underregulated and unregulated markets. Credit betting remains ubiquitous, another factor of potential harm to the consumer, because it's letting people gamble even when they don't have the funds and run up debt. And a key development is the growth of cryptocurrencies, as we mentioned, fairly unheard of even as recently as 5 years ago, but now available on 24% of betting websites. And the majority of unlicensed websites. And the reasons for this, as you can imagine, is that betting with crypto is both appealing for bettors in jurisdictions where it's difficult to fund online betting because it's illegal or unlawful, but it's also particularly attractive to the illegal bookmaker because it allows them to offshore their profits, pay staff anonymously, move funds, and hide the true nature of their operations. Another technical development, we mentioned mirror websites, which 81% of unlicensed websites use. A mirror website is essentially a carbon copy of the website under a different URL. And in the illegal markets, these websites, they won't just have one website, they'll have networks of hundreds. This kind of dot diagram on the right shows one such example of 69 different mirrors of one unlicensed website. So they provide redundancy and business continuity and avoid detection by authorities. Now, it's important to note that because of these, getting a truly accurate indication of the real scale of illegal betting networks can be difficult. Now, for example, when we looked at in the research for the report, we examined, for example, traffic data to one well-known operator, which is licensed in the Philippines. And you find that traffic data to its primary URL is about 28 million visits a year. But if you expand that to its network of 450 plus mirror websites, the total is almost 12 times greater at more than 330 million visits a year. And the vast majority of this traffic coming from Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and other jurisdictions where this operator is not licensed. So again, underlining our key contention that licensed but under-regulated operators are facilitating illegal betting on a vast scale. It's also interesting, as an aside, that even some licensed and regulated operators also use mirror websites, which does beg the question of why would apparently law-abiding companies need such networks of anonymous websites seemingly designed to evade regulatory attention. Another technological factor which is fueling the rise of online betting and illegal betting is the rise of business-to-business software in the online gambling industry. As mentioned, almost 3/4 of the websites we look at use at least one such provider. In summary, all of your trading, your risk management, your data feeds, your customer relationship management, even your license can be got off the shelf from a vast range of operators. There's some literally thousands. So little to no technical expertise is required to set up and run an online betting website. A subset of this is the proliferation of sports betting data feeds, essential for bookmakers to set their odds, especially for lucrative in-play markets. And the supply of such data feeds by the data providers to operators in both regulated, under-regulated, and unregulated segments of the market is essentially fueling the growth in the latter two categories, i.e. illegal betting. The key takeaway here, particularly for the stakeholders from racing and other sports, you need to be aware of the value of your data, and you need to know where it is ending up ultimately. So those are some of the key findings. Thanks for listening to me. In conclusion, if there's 4 key takeaways from section 1 of the report is the definitions are becoming increasingly blurred. We think with those 3 categories, we've kind of hopefully cut through some of that blurriness, but for consumers and regulators, it's very difficult to understand these perhaps finer distinctions. The demand for online betting is outpacing sports and other stakeholders' ability to understand such issues. And technology has made it easier than ever, both to become an illegal bettor and to become an illegal bookmaker. Responsible, licensed, and regulated betting operators bring enormous benefits to society through the huge sums of tax they pay, payments to sport, employment, etc. The illegal markets offer none of these benefits, quite the opposite. They fuel problem gambling, fund organized crime, and relate to criminality, and they corrupt the integrity of racing and other sports. Hopefully our report explains some of these issues to stakeholders, many of whom are on the call, and I encourage you to share it widely. So back to you, Martin. Thank you.
James, thank you very much. Thanks for summarising quite a complex area. And just for the listeners who haven't seen the report itself is around 100 pages. So there's a great deal of data and a great deal of commentary in there. A bit too much to get through in 15 minutes, but thanks, James. You've got a great summary there. We'll move on quickly because we're halfway through already, although I would point out to everyone we can overrun a bit if we need to, if there are questions at the end. So no need to rush. But I'd like to bring in Catherine just to move sideways a bit and talk more about sport. Obviously, we're not just talking about betting in this council with the Asian Racing Federation and with the stakeholders we work with. But the key issue is, how does betting affect sport? And both legal and illegal betting clearly affects sport in many ways, both through the commercialization as well as the impact on integrity. And Catherine is without doubt one of the world's experts in this area. So Catherine, really, could you just give us an overview of what do you think are the key issues, especially from your book, Restoring Trust in Sport, which you're very welcome to hold up a copy on the screen if you have one. I think that's the benefit of webinars, but I'll just say the title again for everyone on there: Restoring Trust in Sport, available on Amazon. And Catherine, just talk us through, what do you think are the key learnings for stakeholders to better protect integrity in horse racing and other sports?
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you to everyone who's joined on today. The Restoring Trust project was a really fascinating one, where I tried to look across as many different examples of best practice that were looking at sports corruption in its broadest possible definition. And I drew on, first of all, our colleagues from the University of Lausanne. And in the first slide, perhaps you'll see, if I can just have a look, yes, that they had a look at the open source media about the definitions of sports corruption and how many different cases were being represented in open source media. And the definition of sports corruption that they used was to look at match fixing, doping, events, bidding processes, contracts and procurement, and a range of other kinds of fraud and other misdemeanors. And so not just an illegal betting question, but more broadly. And as an Australian, I'd like to say that just because Australia features very highly in this map here, you can see that we have the highest number of cases. My assumption is that that is because we have a very active media who is extremely interested in sports corruption and integrity type issues, and will report cases that may go unreported in other settings. So it is interesting to me that Australia features very highly there, and we did have a range of cases during that period that didn't necessarily relate to illegal betting, but they certainly heightened the awareness in the community, not just the sports community, about the importance of integrity in sport. And that's led to the creation of a new organisation, Sport Integrity Australia. But in the book, we looked at a number of different settings, the match fixing case studies that might be of interest to people on the webinar, particularly relating to illegal betting, involved the case study of football in Vietnam. And we also looked at tennis in Australia, which is highlighted in the report for the ARF, where we looked at the types of information that was being sold by sports organisations, which created new betting markets. Now in Australia, it's highly regulated, but that doesn't mean that the data in relation to those very low-level tennis matches were staying in Australia. They were actually being able to, we saw that betting was taking place offshore. And that's where the concern occurs in the sports organisations, is that this can lead to match fixing risk, because the players are not paid very much, and so it's a much easier scenario than you would see for those players that are playing at the very high levels, who may not be tempted by any kind of bribery. The rugby league case in Australia was an interesting one, and perhaps an aberration, but related to the vulnerabilities of athletes that were involved there. And sumo wrestling wasn't a gambling case at all. It's more about the match fixing that's done around honour in Japanese sumo. So that's another interesting case study if somebody is interested in having a look at that. The key learnings, though, from all the different case studies that we looked at is, perhaps the first one is a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's true. Take advantage of a crisis. There's a famous expression: you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And I think that that's certainly true for sports organisations. If you do have a crisis, then that's an opportunity to actually take some really important regulatory and cultural change processes on board that wouldn't otherwise take place. The best example, I think, in restoring trust was one from ice hockey in the Czech Republic. And we saw there that following that scandal that related to bribes for selection in ice hockey, that they completely overhauled their system and created a transparent whistleblowing system and a complaints handling mechanism that allowed cases to be dealt with in a very robust manner. So that was a really great example of taking a crisis and then using it in a positive. In the Football Federation of Australia, there was a crisis in the sense that the International Federation, FIFA, threatened the board with a normalisation committee so that they were going to sack their board if they didn't get democratic representation and gender equality in place. And so that allowed the constitution to be changed to create a gender equality provision of a 40-40-20. Which is a really interesting change. So that's not a match fixing scenario, but it is a major governance reform that came out of a crisis. In FIFA, of course, we know the ExCo were arrested in Switzerland, and that led to major changes in the FIFA constitution. The most recent case involving Blatter and Platini may not give us a great deal of confidence about where those criminal law cases go, but at least from a constitutional perspective, that crisis was certainly taken advantage of. The second point that I want to make to that is that the flip side of taking advantage of a crisis in the positives, of course, is what we saw happen during COVID. As James has neatly pointed out, that all kinds of operators took advantage of the COVID situation to create havoc of all kinds. So organised criminals ramped up their operations. We saw illegal betting being increased. We saw all kinds of different operators in the times of perhaps boredom and lack of regulatory focus while everyone's working at home, to create new markets, so that we saw betting on and gambling in sports that we'd never seen before, whether it was Formula One at home or darts at home or American cornhole or football in countries that had never been involved in gambling before. Table tennis really went through the roof. I'm not really sure what the obsession was with table tennis, but we saw betting in that sport, and that was really a concern because table tennis, unlike its kind of sister sport, tennis, didn't even have an integrity officer prior to October 2021. So table tennis was lagging behind a bit in terms of integrity, and we saw even in Australia, the Victorian Police were involved in taking down a match-fixing syndicate there. So it's really fascinating to see that people have taken an opportunity through a pandemic like COVID to increase the illegal operations. The slide there is just the most recent one of ghost games. We saw a number of different ghost games in football in Brazil, in cricket in Sri Lanka, and this is the most recent cricket tournament that was created for the benefit of Russian bettors. And so they've been taken down by the Indian police, as you can see there, and I think that was just from last week. So there hasn't been a decrease in the illegal activity, even though we've started to open up with sport post-COVID. And then the last takeaway was just to talk about the importance of transparency and vigilance. James has already talked about the mirror sites there, but right the way through the case studies that we looked at in Restoring Trust, it was very clear that robust systems, transparency, and constant vigilance are really the keys to ensuring that sport integrity is the strongest it possibly can be. The example of this most recent article that popped up in relation to these mirror sites was interesting because Jack Kerr, this is a screenshot from his Twitter account, talked about contacting the International Betting Integrity Association and the Maltese Gaming Authority, who already been referred to by James, to try to get an understanding about what are the requirements around licensing the different betting operators, what are the numbers around suspicious betting alerts, and what are the terms upon which suspicious betting alerts will be reported and who will they be reported to, and so on. So it's important that transparency is in place. There are a number of different tools that in the toolbox that can be drawn upon. And I think there are learnings to be had from the broader sports industry, from racing, but also racing can learn something from sport. And ensuring that the national regulators are in place and operating appropriately is one thing, but also to ensure that the culture around transparency and ethical conduct is highlighted and promoted as much as possible are really key if we're going to be going forward and ensuring trust in sport. All right, that's it from me.
Thank you very much. You've given us a very nice link, I think, from the data-driven approach of James's research and the overview of sports betting markets themselves into why that's relevant for sport and the context of sports integrity. So really grateful. Thank you very much. And we will come back with some questions later, I can assure you. Just to press on, if we could go to Professor Jack Anderson. Jack, you've also been studying this area for many years. And I think you've published a great deal as well. So we really want to hear your insight today. Perhaps you can tell us more about the sports law issues, because that's really where your part of the State of Illegal Betting report is focused. In terms of sports law cases, how do you see that's illustrated the threat from the illegal and sometimes legal betting? We can't completely separate them. Obviously, betting itself does in some ways drive manipulation of competitions, but obviously we believe the illegal market drives it to a greater extent. Also in relation to doping, other manipulation, sports governance processes. It's a complex area, and that makes sports law complex. Perhaps you could talk us through how you see the landscape.
Yeah, thanks, Martin, for that, and thanks to Catherine and James for their earlier piece. Apologies, I knocked off the camera there. It's school home time here, so kids pass through, so you're better off not seeing them. Look, I'm going to be brief on this, but I was thinking about what I would say with this, having contributed to the report, etc. And I suppose I was thinking back, 20 years ago to the Breeders' Cup and the Breeders' Cup Classic, which is won by this outsider at 43-1. Volponi won at 43-1. And the trainer, who was a Hall of Famer, well into his 70s by this stage, said in reaction, look, horses don't know the odds. And that may be true, but there was 3 people there that knew the odds very, very well. One of them, an Autotote computer programmer, an employee, who unfortunately for him, given Volponi's unusual win, was the only winner of the Pick Six, and a huge, extensive betting scam was revealed, which was based on the manipulation of unclaimed ticketing data. And eventually, all 3 were criminally convicted and served 18 months on average in jail. And it was, a bad day for the sport internally in terms of the security threats, etc., but also a very bad day with the Breeders' Cup and how important it is in terms of the reputation of the industry in the US. And then if you think of it, we go almost 20 years forward, and here we have Jorge Navarro, a leading trainer at one stage in the US, a very, very successful trainer, and late last year was jailed for 5 years for his part in a huge performance-enhancing drugs scandal in horse racing. Adulterated samples being used for horses, presumably endangering the horses and endangering the jockeys and leading to multiple other fraudulent related charges. And I've given a link in the slides to the original indictment by the Department of Justice in the US from March 2020, which is an extraordinary document to read. 29 people in total charged, and a huge international conspiracy. And remember, you dope horses for a reason, either to get them to win or lose, and therefore manipulate the betting markets. And that's it straightforward. So it's kind of, what I was thinking about was putting those together, because in a way, if you think of it, and I'm just focusing on the US, I'll focus on other jurisdictions in a second, but in 2018 in the US, we have this US Supreme Court decision which liberalizes the regulation of gambling throughout the US. And now 30 of the 50 states in the US has some sort of regulated gambling. And you would imagine that, horse racing has a running start on the other sports, but that's not been the case with this. And I was just looking at the US Gaming Association, which said, sports betting in the US in 2021, it had a handle overall of about 57.2 billion US dollars, revenue of 4.3 billion. Horse racing, 12.2 billion of a handle, 1.8 billion in terms of revenue. And, why isn't horse racing maximizing, as it legitimately can, the regulated industry, if you like? And I thought this was a really interesting article from Forbes, written in early May of this year, just on the eve of the Kentucky Derby, won by Rich Strike. No money from me on that. But it pointed to just a few general points about this. And it said, for a long time, horse racing's reputation has been undermined by internal scandal. Some of them are up on the slides there. And I suppose that's the general point that we're trying to make. Illegal activity, corrupt activity has a corrosive effect on the reputation of a sport. And that includes horse racing. And we're trying to, I suppose, in our reports, raise awareness of this generally, but specifically on the new threats or existing shadow threats of illegal betting. So I suppose that's the kind of point I'm trying to make. And I think Catherine has hinted at it, and I'm not going to go over it, but other sports have struggled with this as well. It's not just racing. Other sports have struggled. I've given you a few and links to some recent cases on this. The first one is a tennis one. Tennis has struggled big time with match fixing from regulated and illegal betting markets. And this case involves a player that was ranked outside the thousands. He was 1,000 and 1,200 ranked in the men's. And what's interesting is, after about the top 100 seeds in tennis, most of the rest of them don't make any money. And they're vulnerable. And they're vulnerable to be approached by illegal betting syndicates. And this is one player who gets a life ban. The second example there is a cricket example. A former Zimbabwe captain approached in India for various reasons related, we think, to illegal gambling, but he is banned for failing to report the approach. And there is also issues about him being blackmailed because of cocaine use. Again, this profiling issue, this vulnerability issue. And again, the point that I'm trying to make is, that the reputation of the sports slips, and it's very hard outside the mainstream sports to replenish that. And I'll just give you an example of athletics as well. And this is a doping example, a recent example, where someone claims that they ate a dodgy pork burrito, and that's why they tested positive. They got a 4-year ban. But those incremental stories about doping, about bad practice in the sport, undermines its reputation. And I'm sure loads of us on this call are big into sport, but how many genuinely know that the World Athletics Championships are on at the minute? And why is that? And is this related to integrity threats? And there's a wider governance issue as well. Poor governance within the sport can be exploited for corruption reasons, including illegal gambling. And anyone who wants to know poor governance in the sport, look at the recent report by Richard McLaren on amateur boxing, and just wallow in that and show that. And this is one of the big sports traditionally in the Olympics, which may now soon lose its place in the Olympics because of corruption related activities. So, you know, I suppose the point that we're trying to make is what are the possible solutions to it? And I've just kind of, you know, looked at these 10 points that we mentioned, not specifically always in the report that we're talking about today, but in our work generally, to remember that as a sport, as all sports, we have a social license, that we have to educate our participants and stewards on best practice and the rules of racing to ensure that they are not ambiguous and that the stewards have the particular power. And I suppose what we're trying to do through this group really is to raise awareness of this issue, to share best practice in these areas. In contrast, in other sports, some of them that I've mentioned, athletics, etc., you know, they've set up their own independent and international integrity units. We're trying to share information through the racing industry on your capacity to gather intelligence, on your capacity to analyze betting, and right through all the way to evaluating what you do in terms of integrity. And I suppose the point that we're specifically trying to make today is to identify future or shadow threats and trends. You know, James already mentioned cryptos. You know, I was doing some work on this recently, and that the cryptocurrency market, the US Fed did a recent report on this. In the last quarter of 2021, reached its height at sorry, that's a very hard thing for an Irish person to say, $3 trillion US. It's now lost 2/3 of its value in a couple of months. And the Fed has talked about, you know, financial innovation versus regulatory evasion. And I think it's the latter that we're all kind of worried about. And those are the types of issues that we've tried to highlight. But we've also tried to highlight through the report that you're dealing here with illegal markets. It's transnational economic crime. It's money laundering. It's tax evasion. It's aggravated problem gambling. It's identity theft. It's consumer fraud. It's data mining. It's regulatory evasion. It's a big issue. And that's what we're trying to kind of shine a light on and hopefully help you. And I suppose my last point is, you know, we're doing it because, you know, of the reputational threats, not just the structural or financial threats, but the reputational threats to sport, and particularly to racing. You know, and just on a personal note, you know, I spoke earlier there about the Breeders' Cup. You know, unfortunately, as a child, I was quite hyperactive, and the only way they used to keep me quiet was put me in front of the TV on a Saturday afternoon watching racing from England. And my dad said, watch that jockey with his bottom in the air. And that jockey was, of course, Lester Piggott. And, you know, my favorite Lester Piggott moment has to be coming back from retirement. And there's the long fella winning on Royal Academy at the Breeders' Cup in 1990. They're the types of stories that we want to talk about. A jockey and a horse stretching every sinew to win a race, not some computer programmer trying to scam us in terms of illegal gambling. And as a 16-year-old, I cashed in on that, and I've had a love of racing ever since. I suppose that's what it's all about. All right, thank you.
Jack, thank you very much. I think you've shown your passion for racing, but also your broader knowledge of all sports. And I think that list of actions you put up was very informative, because obviously, as you said, that those actions are a racing response, but that they're a sports response as well. That they can probably all be transferred to other sports. I think that's the point about the programs we're talking about. Thank you very much. We've got some very good questions, and perhaps I can quickly jump across to them, because as I said, we can overrun, but we really want to bring in your questions and hopefully answer them. Heidi Lester, Cricket Australia. Welcome, Heidi, and thank you very much for the question. If a sporting organisation detects that an offshore licensed betting operator is mirroring markets offered by a licensed local approved betting provider, What steps can they take to address the issue with the offshore operator? James, would you like to talk a little bit about that? And perhaps not, you don't have to go into the specific of that question, although it'd be nice if you can answer it, but mirroring websites is clearly complex and clearly growing. How would you address that with Heidi?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Heidi. I mean, I think maybe this particular case comes back to that issue of data feeds. So it's if I understand the question correctly, you're seeing the same markets, I presume, on cricket, if the question comes from Cricket Australia, and the same odds, and they're moving at the same time in a local Australian licensed operator, but also in offshore unlicensed operators. So that sounds like they're using the same data feed. So it's that point about where is the data coming from, and how can you ensure, it's only been used for a purpose that benefits local licensed operators and local sports in Australia, which, one approach could be to identify where the data feed is from. That could be difficult. Another approach could be to identify where the offshore operator is located or its corporate entity. That can be difficult. You'll typically find it's just going to be a post office box in the British Virgin Islands or in Cyprus. So identifying the ultimate beneficial owner, somebody who you can complain to or take legal action, can be difficult. And then if it's, in the case of the most egregious operators, you won't be able to find any information whatsoever. So it is difficult, but I think identifying the corporate behind that website or operator, which is kind of stealing your markets, as it were, is a first step. And then you maybe can try to exert legal pressure. The problem is a lot of these offshore, we call them licensed but under-regulated operators, just simply won't care and will probably ignore you. So that's probably not very helpful, but it's kind of gets to the root of the problem and why it's a big issue.
Thanks, James. I think, as you said earlier, obviously a great many or most of those operators are effectively illegal, and it's a criminal opportunity. I think that's why it's grown in the past 1 decade especially, but 2 decades. I think we've seen that growth across it.
I think in Australia, just to add, I mean, I know that ACMA, the Australian Communications Media Authority, has taken action against unlicensed operators. So perhaps working with them in this specific case for Heidi could help.
A very good point to highlight. I'd also highlight Catherine's point earlier about Australia and the number of cases in Australia and relate the two, because I wanted to mention for Catherine, I think the point about Australia is it's a leader in sports integrity. Catherine mentioned the scrutiny by the media, but also the attention in sports to integrity. The fact that Australia had the first law enforcement sports integrity unit in the Victoria Police, set up by Graham Ashton, who, when he was commissioner of Victoria Police, and Graham's now a member of the ARF Council as well. So I think Australia does better than most countries, and the ACMA example is interesting because I think there's a point there that that consumers at least know which websites are illegal. They may be able to go to websites through a VPN, but that's a step they have to take, and hence there's greater education for the consumer about the illegality of a website. Perhaps we can jump back to Catherine as well, and we have a question from Lucy Mullins, who does work in integrity in racing, and Lucy's asked, as Jack has mentioned, the identification of integrity-related misdemeanors in sport when reported in the media create a negative image of the integrity of the sport affected. There's a study on that, which we won't get into now, but Jack can point out later. But actually, the identification and action in relation to whatever the issue was could actually be a sign of greater integrity and interest, similar to Catherine's view as to why Australia has higher numbers. How can people involved in maintaining the integrity of sport balance this issue? How do you tackle integrity problems whilst creating a positive reaction, or at least minimizing the negative public and media reaction? A very good question, Lucy, and one that I've dealt with in the past working in integrity in racing. Catherine, your thoughts broadly on sports. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Lucy. I think that you're exactly right. And this has been an issue for anti-doping, for example, because statistics can be used in either way, can't they? Because if you have large numbers of integrity issues being reported, they'll say, wow, there's a big problem here. If you have no integrity issues being reported, then you'll say there's either no problem or we're not looking. So I think it's about the messaging and the communication. And when you have an organization that is set up on a culture of ethical leadership and integrity, then the messaging continues to be clear and say, we are transparently dealing with this, and this is what we've received, this is what we did with it, and this has been the result, and this is how we're ensuring this doesn't happen again. And I think that communication loop is really crucial so that people can see what you are doing and that you are walking the talk, because that's what's really important in this environment.
Want to come back to Professor Anderson, because the law is the law. Jack, I want to bring one of the questions and perhaps try and take it to a legal perspective if we can. So from Todd Buckingham, he's asked, is there a correlation on where the illegal sites are located and where the location of the punters are? i.e., are the illegal sites mainly pointing towards Asian customers or elsewhere? I think that's not just a market question. There's a legal question, and perhaps you could bring that back to both where the target audience is and also the legal aspects of that.
Yeah, I suppose the key, the answer to that is within the report. We give quite a good and quite precise examples of jurisdictions and websites which are the origins of unlicensed and unregulated betting, and we name certain jurisdictions where there is that issue. And with regard to the targeting of punters, the straightforward answer is that these websites are based in countries where there is either no regulation, light regulation, or the regulation is that betting is prohibited, and therefore they act in that shadow and dark kind of area. I suppose the target is not jurisdiction bound, which is exactly our problem. That is our problem, and it's to the earlier question of appealing to an offshore market as well. And I think that what is interesting in that is the point that I'm trying to make, that this is a transnational economic problem. And our problem is the irregular and illegal flows of money through these betting websites to these jurisdictions, these named jurisdictions. And then the problem that we have, the problems that I've mentioned, both legal problems and financial problems. But I think the greater point, and this is the point for all of us on this call, which is the answer is, whatever about correlations, whatever about jurisdictions or types of websites, the answer that we have to think about as an industry as a whole is, what do we do? What do we do? How do we specifically measure this illegal market? And what do we do in response to try and shut it down or restrict what it's doing to us now in a proper? And that's a big question. We haven't got the answer to that yet, but we're hoping that through this work and through the identification of the various betting websites and key jurisdictions, we can begin to move there.
Jack, thank you very much. And I think you've given in the last part of your answer the key point, which is what can we do? This is not an academic study. Obviously, we need scholars like you and Catherine to help better understand the scale of the problem and the context of it. But there have to be solutions for racing and sports about how to deal with betting markets. And it's a transnational problem, which often makes it difficult or impossible for the authorities to even consider. So in terms of that question, what can we do? Perhaps I can, if you don't mind, Catherine and Jack, give James the last question. And I'd like to put two questions together, James, if I could. So BK Tay from Singapore and Matt Stevens, and let you take them both, James. So BK Tay, what can or should legal operators emphasize or focus on in view of this fast-growing and evolving illegal market environment? is it a lost cause? A very good point, especially in the Asian context, where obviously some of these offshore illegal markets are huge, and it's very difficult to penetrate them or combat them. And then Matt Stevens, a little bit longer question. I won't ask all of this, but Matt's asking, I take your point about regulators in well-regulated markets need to ensure they don't over-regulate to ensure those markets are competitive with illegal markets. Yet on the other hand, the illegal markets tend to offer more risky gambling products and options. It's a good point. So how do you not over-regulate, but how do you compete with those illegal markets that clearly are that clearly are offering products that would not be acceptable in many well-regulated markets? So James, in light of what Jack's just said about we have to take action, the industry itself has to take action, racing and sports authorities have to take action, and BK Tay's point, is it a lost cause? What would you say is the way forward?
Yeah, I hope it's not a lost cause. Otherwise, we might as well all give up. I don't think it is, but it cannot be tackled by any one organization, any one sport. It can't be tackled by the Asian Racing Federation alone, or one regulator. It's got to be a widespread system of stakeholder engagement, and that's what we are trying to do. We're trying to get academia, law enforcement, media, other sports, not just racing. It's great to see so many high-ranking people from other sports around the world on the call, and also, the well-regulated, the licensed and well-regulated betting operators, and work together to help inform and educate people about these problems, because it is a niche topic. There's been a lot more coverage in particularly the last year, which is good to see, but we still see, for example, Manchester City, the biggest football or the richest football club in the world, taking sponsorship from very dubious betting operators, which don't seem to be, have any real people involved. And you think, why are you doing that? So things like that show that the message still has a long way to go and needs to get across. In terms of how can the legal operators compete, so one aspect is that, educating people about the problem. The other aspect is having a bit more flexibility to be competitive. Now, Matt raises a very good point. When we say competitive, that doesn't mean offer everything that the illegal market has. These crazy virtual products that offer very harmful gambling products. But it's a bit more flexibility to, e.g., perhaps offer a wider range of sports of proven high integrity in order to compete against these operators. It's perhaps lowering the regulatory burden and the tax oversight in some markets, where certain operators can be paying as much as 50% of their profits in betting duty when you're competing against a legal market which pays zero tax or extremely minimal tax in these offshore jurisdictions. So again, these are things that the relevant stakeholders and government need to be made aware of. It's very easy for them just to look at the licensed and well-regulated market and think, well, we need to raise another large amount of revenue. Let's increase the taxes, or let's increase the burden in other ways. But that will only drive people to these illegal markets where, and it's a good point that Matt says about consumer protection. And a key point is that these illegal markets don't just have none of the responsible gambling safeguards of the legal market. They actually cause problem gambling at a much higher rate, because it's in their interest to keep people hooked, to keep them betting as long as possible, to extend credit and loans, and it basically, a problem gambler is their ideal customer in many ways. So highlighting that difference between consumer protections is another key point that I think Matt raises. So those are maybe some ideas. I'm rambling on a bit. I'll leave it there, but
Well, that's good. Thanks, James. I think you've also touched on Professor Sally Gainsbury's excellent commentary in the ARF report, which we will come on to on another day. I think V. Moodley in South Africa has made a comment which sort of sums up or starts to answer Jack's question as well. It needs to be a collective strategy to overcome this pandemic and problem. It's clearly, that's what we've been talking about with the ARF for some time. We need broad stakeholder engagement and a collective strategy involving government policymakers, government regulators, sports authorities, etc. It cannot be sports on their own, clearly. And in that regard, to sports on their own and dealing with the problem, I would just like to give Catherine and then Jack a chance to give sort of minute each in response to Tjeerd Warner's. Tjeerd from the Netherlands, he organises the national platform there for the European Commission to deal with sports integrity. And Tjeerd has asked, do you have any views on how to take this out of the sporting context and start seeing this as a crime that happens in sport? And with that, getting onto the higher agenda with law enforcement. Also, what role would a potential WADA-like integrity agency for a broader set of integrity issues play in this? Big questions for sport. So, Catherine and then Jack, would you like to give it a minute each, as we still have a few people on, your views on Tjeerd's question?
That's an excellent point, Tjeerd, and thank you very much for the question. I think it probably does come back to what V's mentioned about having collective action. And it's important that the different stakeholders are working together, because we can see that there are societal implications for the community that go much broader than sport, as you point out. So this debate about whether or not we should have a world integrity agency, much like WADA, is an interesting one, and it's being debated. And I wonder whether or not it could come out of something like the United Nations UNCAC, the Anti-Corruption Convention, because that has a lot of tools that the number of countries that have signed up to that. And if there was greater emphasis on the implementation of that convention, then we could see increased action around national legislation, criminalisation being one of them, but also through corporate regulation. And we're not seeing great enough regulation in this space. And there's certainly a lot of space for countries to lift their regulatory responses and take it out of just the sport policy space, as you say. So I think that there are certainly tools in the toolbox that are not currently being used to their full capacity. And if we could help push that, Australia is one of the examples, and I'm not even sure Australia would say that it's yet at best practice stage. There's more work to be done always, but at least we have got now the Sport Integrity Australia, and I saw that there were representation online from Sport Integrity Australia, so hello to colleagues there, and that has increased the information sharing between the different stakeholders, law enforcement and sport bodies and gambling operators as well, that really has improved this space. So if other countries could adopt something similar, we would go a long way to combating this challenge.
Yeah, and my answer to this, I'm a bit wary of this Australian loving. We have to be wary of these Australians. Yeah, but just on the first point, there are two excellent points. Just for the first point, convincing governments of the importance of this is a difficult task, because and I've tried it myself. They dismiss it as sport. I mean, who cares really? Some bookie gets ripped off, it doesn't really matter. But then you mention tax evasion, then you mention money laundering, then you mention identity theft, then you mention offshore transnational economic crime, and it becomes more important. And that, I think that's where you have to convince them that there are consumer issues. Consumers vote for you. There are financial issues which affect your budget, and that's how you try and convince governments of the importance of it, within the context, of course. And as regards to kind of a World Anti-Corruption Agency, I do think that the international sports needs an international sports ombudsman for maladministration, governance and abuse of athletes type issues, an independent office like that. I would not go down the route of that, looking at gambling related activities, because that differs so much from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But Catherine's exactly right that the UN's work led by people like Ronan O'Leary, who is involved in our group, and the Anti-Corruption Convention is exactly the way to go, which neatly draws the government point with the sport point through the UN's actions on anti-corruption.
Thank you very much, Jack, and thank you very much, Catherine. And really nice to mention both of you that United Nations, UNODC, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Ronan and his team doing some great work, collaborating on the protection of sport from corruption, and Interpol, I should mention as well. Claudio Marinelli leading the Interpol Match Fixing Task Force. So there are some international organizations with some reach and depth into government policy making, influence on government policy making, who I think we should continue to leverage because they're key stakeholders. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the around 80 people who stayed on a little bit over the 1 hour. It's always difficult to concentrate on a webinar, but really grateful to you for taking the time to listen, and thank you very much for all the questions. Thank you very much to James, Catherine and Jack for some terrific comments and discussion. It does bring it to life rather than reading just a 100-page report. So really grateful for you to making the time. Everyone, please do read the report though. It's available to download on Google Play, Rakuten Kindle, Amazon, Rakuten Kobo, Amazon Kindle, or just the Asian Racing Federation website. So thank you very much to all the council members, and thank you very much to the audience for attending. And I should remind you, if you'd like to hear it again, we have another webinar next week with several other of the council members, where they'll be discussing slightly different aspects of the report. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day or a good evening. Goodbye for now.